Welcome back to my channel, fellow Padawans. My name is Brian Kafaki. We'll talk about what are Azure Data Services, because if you don't know, you're not alone. I'm going to talk about IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. It's talked about a lot, so I won't spend a lot of time, but it's really important in this video. And then I'll do an overview of each data service one by one and kind of give you a picture of the ecosystem involved. It's not bad, stick with me, and don't worry, we'll get through it. And then I'll wrap things up. When we think about cloud services, the standard diagram is this one. And this diagram has the sort of one spectrum to the other. At the bottom of the spectrum is infrastructure as a service. This is really the origin of the cloud itself. When you think infrastructure service, what it really comes down to is a new kind of concept, a whole new technology called virtualization. What is virtualization? It's really weird, even for me, after all these years, I still find it hard to believe we do this, but we use programs that simulate hardware. So people call it software as hardware, really weird. So I have a computer, and let's say it's got a lot of memory and it's really fast, and I say, well, I don't want to use this as just one computer. I'm going to use software to divide it up, and I'm going to create 2 machines or 3 machines. And I'll use one machine to be my database server. I'll use another machine to be a web server, and I'll use that other machine to play games because I like to play games. So the idea is I'm using 3 different machines, but I've only got one computer. The ability here is really amazing. I can define different network cards, different ports. I can treat each one really as a separate box, but it's all in software. That's really the trick of the entire cloud. The other services are all resting on top of that feature. It's been brought to a whole new level with something called containerization and all that stuff, but I'm not going to get into that here. But just realize that's what started. And as these things became big, you can picture large companies, they had a lot of machines. So they started to call those private clouds, because once you created these virtual machines, you might have 100 physical boxes, but you've got 1,000 virtual machines. And companies internally could swap them out. And the nice thing about the idea it's software and not hardware is I can reconfigure, I can bring them down, bring them up. I could create a replica here while I take this one down to do work and then swap them out. So I have a lot of flexibility, and it makes things a lot easier to work with than the physical hardware. Now let's go to the top of the pyramid, software as a service. This has been around longer than you might think, but it's really hidden because you just use it. So things you want to think about is use Office. That's really, using a lot of back-end cloud services, including, you'll notice, you have to log in and it's verifying with Microsoft's cloud that you really have this. Power BI is another one that's very enmeshed, but you don't have to think about it. You don't think about, well, where am I going to store this, and where's the blob storage, and where's my physical account, and do I have a C drive? You don't think about all these things. You just use it. If you've used a browser to get at email, I use it all the time to get at my Outlook account. That's the same idea too, right? I go into a browser. Browser doesn't know anything about me, but I use my credentials. I get in, I get email, I get my calendar, I can do all these things. That's truly software as a service. So those are 2 sides of a spectrum. What I want to focus on when I talk about data services is platform as a service. What is that? Glad you asked. It's a balance between the ease of use and control over what you're doing, your environment and your hardware. So let's look at this. You can see that software as a service has really easy to use. We just use it. But we don't have a lot of control. When I'm in my mail, I don't specify where it should be putting my mail and storage accounts or things like that. I don't even know what virtual machines it uses under the covers. I just use the service. So I have very little control, but I have a lot of ease of use. On the infrastructure service, I have control over everything. I define my network cards. I define my VPN, or what they call VNets in Azure. I got to tell it everything. I was amazed the first time I created VM how many steps there are. It's insane, right? I have to have an admin account, and I have to tell everything. So that's infrastructure service. This is what I would call the sweet spot. You're trying to get the maximum, the ideal balance. But the ideal balance for what? Well, I want to step back. Think of applications that companies have, they use, whether it's on-premise or wherever. Think of something like maybe they have a client-facing web app that they sell products to, right? What do we have there? We have a web server, and we have an application, right? So we have to manage an application. We have to manage some sort of web server. We probably have some sort of database servers on the back end, maybe many of them that are orchestrated. And on and on. We have to have storage. So all these different layers we have to manage, we have to control. We might also have internal systems. We might have general ledgers and financial systems and accounting and on and on and on, right? And in hospitals, a popular thing is like Epic. Epic is the big healthcare EMR system for records, etc. All these systems require these back-end services, I'll call them application supporting services, database services, web services, security services, on and on and on, right? There's all these things that have to go on to support them. Now, these are not possible systems to turn into software as a service because there's too much necessity to configure and control them, right? You've got to manage a lot, and it's not something you can just throw it up there and say, do whatever you want with Epic. It's okay. You can't do that. You've got to tell it. You've got to tell it how important this is and how much replication you may want to have, redundancy, so that if something goes wrong, you're not patients on waiting. Sorry, I can't bill you. I can't get the ICD code in here, and you can't get service. You can't do that, right? So platform as a service is a very different animal. The goal of it is, when you think of these services, I'm very close to the database services, but any of these services, you've got changes all the time. There's new releases, there's security patches, there's all kinds of monitoring that needs to happen. Is somebody attacking us? In the database world, you have to worry about performance. Are we getting bottlenecks? Are we running out of space? All these different things. Now, I know like database administrators spend a lot of time performance tuning, tracking down problems, worrying about John, who every Monday morning runs a runaway query and brings the database down or chokes up resources. All these things are extremely costly to the business, and they're really spending a lot of cycles on employees to maintain. And here's the problem. If I'm a healthcare company, I'm working, it's a hospital, I want to be servicing patients, not performance tuning a database. I want you to be focused on the value to the patient. If I'm a financial planning company, or I'm someone like Microsoft, I want to be focusing on what delivers value to the customer and what also can return revenue to us, right? That's important. Maximize what. This doesn't do that at all. Now, I've heard, I don't know the whole thing, but I've seen it in Microsoft. They tend to look at what really helps the customer, and that tends to be what they keep focused on inside. And sometimes if it's not something relevant to the customer, you think of something like cafeteria services, they'll typically outsource it because they want to focus on what matters most to their customers. And that's where PaaS really comes in. So I'm going to make a claim that I believe, so I'll make it opinion, but I think the highest value of the cloud is in the PaaS area. Because most companies throughout the world have a vast investment and spend a ton of money on their applications. Those are running the business. There's a lot of resources involved. And if you can balance this and move it into a PaaS solution, you just get an incredible value that wasn't possible before. You save tons of money. You've got employees focused on making your business more money and getting value to the customer. And it's just a win-win across the board. The other areas are nice, but they're not doing the same thing. This level of possibilities just goes up. Now, I wanted to bring up something because typically when you think of something like SQL Server, you pay a license cost. If you were to create a VM, virtual machine, in Azure, and you want to install SQL Server, you must pay a licensing fee. So that's required. But when you use a PaaS service, there isn't, to my knowledge in all these areas, there's not a specific license cost. Now, I put an asterisk there because I did see things online where Microsoft wants to encourage migration to Azure, and they want to encourage people to use PaaS services, so they'll do things to discount. Well, you already have a license, you paid for it, so let us discount the service so you don't lose that value you paid for. But the idea when you go in, for instance, create an Azure SQL Database, you're not going to say, oh, well, where's your license? And you got to plug in a license ID and stuff. That's not part of that. Now, I want to also step back and talk about why so many tools. I was at a Ignite conference a few years ago, and a customer was getting upset with yet another tool. And this one was actually called Azure Machine Learning Workbench. The customer was not happy. We got so many tools. Why another one? Well, I want to explain it before I jump in, before you get upset, and just explain the different tools have different use cases. They have the strengths, they have the weaknesses, and that's the key. The weakness is the part that really makes you have to say, oh, so that's not best for this tool. And weakness just means it's not optimized for certain things. So you got a hammer. Hammers are great for putting in nails. In fact, Of all the tools here, you're not going to do very well except for the hammer. I've used a flashlight, broke my flashlight, and now I use a hammer. You know what I mean? That's kind of where you're going. If I want to draw lines or do angles, I'm going to use something like this ruler here. Screws are good. Use a screwdriver, the wrench, and the saw is good for cutting wood or metal if you got the right tip saw. Every tool has its function, has its purpose, and they work well together. So let's jump into Azure Data Services, the riveting point that we've been all waiting for, glued to our seats. I'm going to talk about platform as a service, and then I'll talk about a couple of common services. So these are the PaaS offerings. The first one I want to talk about is SQL Database, and assume all of these say Azure before them. I'm saving space and redundancy. I won't say that, but they all say Azure. So Azure SQL Database. It's the first PaaS offering of SQL Server I know of. Key takeaway with Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance, though, is when you think of on-site, on-premise SQL Server, you actually have at least 5 services. You've got the database service, integration services, analysis services, reporting services, and machine learning services. And I don't know if they've added any more, but that's enough for me right now. When you talk about SQL Database or SQL Managed Instance, you're only talking about one service. You're talking about the database service. Okay? That's okay. It is not designed for offloading data warehouses with all the BI things around it. Okay, that's not what it's targeted at. It's targeted at what you call OLTP, online transaction processing. And that is typically what I mentioned before, your applications. You've got some sort of order system. When somebody orders something, you need to write a row or two or whatever into SQL Server and save it. So you've got maybe, you can store procedures, you've got tables, you've got databases, you've got views, and on and on. That's what it's targeted at, that transaction processing. It's not targeted at reporting and all those things. SQL Database was the first offering. It's great, but it lacks a lot of things that you would normally have in the full version of SQL Server. And I don't mean just the services. You cannot, for instance, do cross-database joins in Azure SQL Database. You don't have SQL Agent, which is this job scheduler. There's no service broker, which is actually a backbone to a lot of things that happen in SQL Server. So SQL Database, when I think about it, to me, it's a bit more of a lightweight thing. It's a great service to use if you're creating a new application. Not really very easy in most cases to take a heavy-duty, high-performance, mission-critical database and move it into Azure in a migration. And I believe because of that, SQL Managed Instance came along. With Managed Instances, it kind of addressed all of those issues that I mentioned and made it implement the 90-something% range of what the Azure SQL Database service provides, including things like SQL Agent and Service Broker and all these good things. So you kind of have to look at it from that angle, and that's really been a pretty new service. When I was at Microsoft a couple of years ago, it's very resource intensive, so Microsoft kind of had to ease it out into their cloud so that it just didn't consume everything right away, because believe me, SQL databases in large companies can be very resource intensive. But those are the first two. Analysis services next to Databricks is my favorite service. It doesn't get as much attention at Microsoft, and I really feel sad about that. As a TSP, I was always promoting it. What I love about it is it's related to Power BI. So you have Power BI. Now, the traditional way Power BI is used and presented, if you've used it from Office, is you create a data model, you create your views, you create your dashboards, etc. And what you have is you get a project. Well, embedded in that project is actually a database. And it's a very specific type of database. It's sometimes called the semantic layer. But what it is a database specifically designed for really optimal slicing and dicing. It's called the tabular model. And what it does is it loads into memory, all in memory. It must be fit into memory. There's no paging here. And you can instantly slice and dice all kinds of stuff. And that's why Power BI is so great at doing dashboards and slicing and dicing with click speed response. Analysis services is a service that allows you to decouple that presentation layer from your database layer, and then you can really manage the analysis services separate from like Power BI. One of the nice things also is it's really easy now to use, say, Excel and slice and dice against that analysis service because Excel supports the APIs of analysis services. But there are several APIs within analysis services that things like Tableau can even use. So Tableau, not as fully as say Power BI, but Tableau can to some extent also use the tabular model or the analysis services models. Now that service is one of the services I mentioned that if you had enterprise SQL Server on-premise, then one of the services would be SQL Server Analysis Services. On-premise, there's a more legacy model called the MD, a multidimensional model, which is not supported on Azure. You get the tabular model, which is what the Power BI service uses. So MDX goes way back, a little further back. So take away with analysis services, think Power BI data source, and you're good. We're going to get into more detail with that. I have some videos. I'll post a video at the end of this with links to other videos, and one is really on the tabular model and why you need it. Really, really impressive. Synapse. Synapse is a branding confusion problem in some ways because it had been called Azure Data Warehouse for a while. On-premise, it had been called, I believe it was SQL PDP, which is Parallel Data Processing. It's what's called a scale-out architecture, meaning it runs multiple SQL Server instances at the same time and breaks out the work to increase the processing speed. They've renamed it a little over a year ago called Synapse, and the new name. It's a big data service based on SQL, really based on SQL Server itself. So that's what it is. We'll talk more about it when we get there. Cosmos DB is a really interesting one, and I tend to think it causes confusion because because it does multiple things. It's kind of like a Sybil. If you remember the personality disorder, a person had many personalities. Cosmos DB is multiple personality disorder on steroids, but it's intentional. What Cosmos DB offers is essentially a data storage layer. We'll say data storage is down here. But you don't have to worry about that. You just say, what API do you want to use to access this? So if you want to use Mongo, and the focus here is NoSQL, meaning not only SQL, because SQL is an API, and NoSQL has been renamed somewhere along the way to mean not only SQL, because SQL's everywhere now. Never went away. That's another story. Anyway, let me get back to this. So if you want to use MongoDB, it used to be something called DocumentDB way back that got merged into Cosmos. There's a graph database API and several other types of APIs that you can use. I believe one's also called a table API. So if you want to use one of those APIs, Cosmos DB is a good thing to use. It's also geo-distributed, so it can replicate your data and make it available in different regions for very quick access. So it's low latency, super quick access, etc., etc. I don't personally believe it's designed for the typical data warehouse, analytics, or machine learning types of applications, but I do think there are times when it could be really well suited to do that. But I'll talk about that when I get into that area, but I just want to try to clarify what some of these things are. HDInsight, and I'll tell you what the HD stands for because it took me a while to figure it out. HD stands for the Hortonworks distribution, which is an open source, it's a distribution of the open source Apache Hadoop project ecosystem. There's a lot of different services contained in that ecosystem. HDInsight supports several of them. So HDInsight is not one thing, and that can be a little confusing. There's for instance, a service called Kafka, which is really meant for streaming, kind of a message queue kind of thing, and it collects things. So you've got Kafka. So again, that's more streaming oriented. You've got HBase, which is a very high-speed, big data kind of database. You've got Hadoop MapReduce, which in the advent of big data, Hadoop MapReduce was sort of the thing, right? But MapReduce had a lot of shortcomings, and a newer, sort of a better, I think, implementation of the idea of big data scale out is something called Apache Spark. Now, when you talk about Apache Spark, which is, I believe, by far really the most popular open source big data platform, then you need to also think about Databricks, because Databricks is a wrapper around Apache Spark, and it has a lot of value-added services, and it was optimized and built and designed for the cloud. HDInsight, I mentioned, was open source, is not optimized for the cloud, and it's been around a while on Azure. There's some confusion because when you talk about those two specific things, you're talking about Spark, and the question is going to come up, well, which should I use? I'll talk about that when I get to that video, because it's not a simple answer, and it really, unfortunately, as DBAs always say, it depends. I have to say depends. So these are the basic data services I'm going to talk about, and now I want to talk about common services that are used in support of these services. And the first one is Azure Data Factory. In a nutshell, if you think of SQL Server Integration Services and what it does, if you know that, then that's what Azure Data Factory is, but for Azure. And that's a key difference, though, because in SQL Server, SSIS, as it's abbreviated, is really meant to ultimately bring data into SQL Server. But obviously, Azure Data Factory has got a lot of different services you can see here, in addition to different storages and applications. So it's got a much broader architecture and set of use cases. But it ultimately is ETL. And when I say ETL, I mean ELT, LLT, whatever you want to call it. I don't worry about all these flipping around the letters. To me, you're going to be bringing data from a source. Your goal is to get it somewhere else. You're going to go through some layers we call transformations, and then you want to use it there. The thing about data that's great is no matter where it is, somebody wants it somewhere else, and your job is to move it there, which is why I was never out of a job, because I did a lot of that. So that's Azure Data Factory. Now, a chameleon in the Azure system is something called Azure ML. Let me say that again, Azure ML, machine learning. Azure machine learning is a very interesting thing because depending on how you use it, there is a user interface, and you could say in that sense it's software as a service. You could also say that, I can use it from Databricks within a notebook and call it, and maybe I'd call that more of a PaaS service. And there are things that make it like that. However, I'm considering both and also sort of a backbone service. One of the few I would call just a raw backbone service, maybe a little more like Azure Directory almost, because Azure ML is something when you see the demos and Ignite, they just did a bunch of these, here I am in Dynamics and I'm going to do some stuff in Dynamics CRM to do a model that will predict sales, or I'm in Power BI and I want to do some model training, on and on. Those services that are being used to do the model training and all that in deployment, that's Azure ML. And it's just kind of hidden from you. To me, it's almost this, ubiquitous backend service. But you can also go in and there's a GUI you can use, which is Azure ML Studio. And you can use that now as front end. Or you can do things, as I mentioned, in like Databricks notebooks and things. So it's meant to be used, I think, from anywhere. And it's kind of a centralized place to do machine learning model training, etc. So those are the basic services here. I did not talk about Azure Data Lake. And I usually like to be specific because there was a Data Lake 1, so I say Azure Data Lake Service Gen 2. ADLS Gen 2 is really a storage system, like Blob, or like the file system, etc. So it's not really a data platform service, okay? It matters, but it's something you could use any one of these services and never use Data Lake. But you'd probably be missing something if you're in the world of a lot of data, because what Azure Data Lake really is doing is it's implementing the Hadoop file system, HDFS, on blob storage. And it's not implementing it literally. It's implementing the API. So the underlying usage and storage in Azure is actually a lot better than the open source HDFS that you'd think of. It's much faster and does better. But that's what it's doing. So definitely, I talk a lot in my book about Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 and all these great things, but you want to take a look at that. But again, it's not something I would talk about separately because it's really an option within these services. So wrapping up, in my last picture of the Azure logo on my mug here, wrapping up, what are the Azure Data Services? And that really comes down to this IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. Most important thing we learned is that the platform as a service is designed to extract out the layers within company, corporate applications, database services, internet services, application services, and make them truly just callable, usable services with as little maintenance as possible so that you can focus on the core business value. And I went through and I did an overview of the Azure Data Services. These are the PaaS services I mentioned. So we talked about everything from the Azure SQL Server, SQL DB, and Managed Instance, all the way up to Databricks and Spark. A lot of different things in there to look at. I'm going to go through, as I mentioned, one by one and give you a better picture of what they are and how they fit in. And I want to thank you for watching this. Please share, subscribe, and I appreciate the audience, the comments and everything people give me. If there's any confusion, whatever, put a comment in. I do watch that. I really appreciate the feedback I get. It's been very encouraging to see that people are getting value out of this. It's great. And I'm trying, anything you can do to help me get the word out that I have this channel so I can help more people, that'd be great. Don't forget to buy my book. It's a riveting book. It's a page turner. And remember to keep calm and carry on.